A flight attendant disrespected a black CEO's injured son, but the father swiftly turned the situation around, and the airport had to face serious consequences for its negligence. A flight attendant flipped the black CEO's injured son out of his wheelchair, thinking no one would hold him accountable. He didn't realize the father could flip the entire airport contract instantly. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true authority rises. Dr. Karen Vance pushed his son's wheelchair toward the check-in counter at Rindler International Airport, moving with calm precision despite the steady buzz of the terminal. Behind his composed expression, his mind ran through details of the regulatory presentation scheduled in Valor City, timelines, research briefs, board expectations. But all that focus shifted the moment he noticed how long the gate agents were whispering. It wasn't obvious at first. People whispered all the time in airports. But something in their timing, their posture, the way one of them tilted a monitor slightly to block Karen's view, it was deliberate. Subtle, but deliberate. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but calculation. His instinct, honed from years of boardroom betrayals and hostile takeovers, told him something here wasn't right. He adjusted the black scarf around Darius's shoulders and leaned in. "You doing okay?" Darius, 12, pale and still healing from a complex femoral surgery, nodded quickly but glanced at the agents again. "Dad, people keep looking at us." Karen followed his son's gaze. One of the agents, a lean man with neatly trimmed sideburns and a silver pin on his lapel, glanced away too quickly. The other, shorter and rounder, tapped at his tablet without typing. "Don't worry," Karen said softly, giving Darius's shoulder a steadying squeeze. "Just routine checks. We'll be in the air before you know it." But even as he said it, Karen spotted something that broke routine entirely. Up on a mezzanine above Gate 9, a man stood just outside the coffee kiosk. He wore a Navy utility vest, the kind usually issued to logistics supervisors or equipment crew. But unlike the others around him, he wasn't moving, wasn't working. He was watching, not just idly scanning the crowd, watching Karen and Darius, unmoving. His eyes locked for a beat too long, then dropped to a device in his hand. He tapped it twice. Not swiped. Tapped like triggering something. Karen turned his attention back to the boarding gate for Flight Virion 813. The sign blinked. On time. Yet the air seemed heavier now. Darius winced slightly as his wheelchair bumped over the thick carpet seams, and Karen leaned down. "Tell me if it hurts." "It's fine," Darius muttered, gripping the armrests tightly. His leg, wrapped in a specialized medical brace, extended slightly ahead of him in a padded sling. He hated the attention it brought, especially from adults who talked louder when pretending not to notice. As they reached the pre-boarding lane, the lead flight attendant emerged. Orvin Lusk, tall, square-jawed, and dressed with meticulous neatness. Orvin's presence wasn't welcoming. His sharp blue eyes dropped to Darius's wheelchair, and his expression tightened, not with concern but with distaste, like someone had brought dirt onto his polished floor. Karen held out the boarding documents and medical certifications. Passenger 4A and 4B. Pre-cleared medical mobility and security tags. Flight Virion 813. Orvin didn't take them right away. His gaze flicked to Karen, then Darius, and lingered. Then, slowly, he took the documents without a word and turned to the gate officer standing nearby, red and Vorse, according to his badge. "Review these," Orvin said in a tone too flat to be casual. Karen kept his voice calm. "Is there a problem?" "Nothing yet," Orvin said. "Just ensuring consistency with our safety standards." The words were polite. The tone wasn't. Karen's eyes narrowed just slightly, a microscopic reaction, but Orvin caught it and almost smiled. That was the opening he wanted. Darius shifted again, whispering, "Why is he looking at us like that?" Karen lowered his voice. "Ignore him. Let's just get to our seats." Red and Vorse now held the documents, flipping through them far slower than necessary. We may need to reassess this," he said vaguely, not looking up. "Just verifying certain mobility protocols." "Hang dai." Karen stayed silent. Though he knew the stalling wasn't procedural, it was pretext. He glanced again toward the mezzanine. The man in the navy vest had moved, now positioned just above the gate desk, watching from the shadows cast by the steel support rails. Darius fidgeted, adjusting the brace with a quiet wince. Orvin stepped closer, folding his arms. "You know," he said, crouching slightly so only Karen could hear him, "some passengers get special treatment, but not all deserve it." Karen turned toward him, eyes cool. "Is that your personal opinion or company policy?" Orvin gave a half-smile and straightened. "Just making conversation." The implication was clear. This wasn't about protocol. Moments later, the boarding announcement played. Priority passengers were called. Karen wheeled Darius forward. As they reached the ramp entrance, Orvin stepped in front of it. "You sure your son can handle turbulence?" he asked. It wasn't concern. It was a challenge. Karen paused. "He's cleared for flight under surgical observation. We've submitted the documents twice." Orvin's eyes flicked past them, and Karen felt it, that strange sensation of being nudged toward reaction. From the corner of his eye, Karen noticed something else. The gate officer was now claiming the boarding authorization form for wheelchair access had been misfiled. "I'm sorry, Dr. Vance," Redden said flatly. "I'm going to need you to fill this out again." "But we already—" Darius started. Karen gently raised a hand, stopping his son. "We'll comply. Please hand me the form." As he took the clipboard, Karen looked over the top of it and locked eyes with Orvin. The man was waiting for a crack, for Karen's composure to break. But it didn't. Instead, Karen smiled faintly. The kind of smile that made men like Orvin worry. Unseen behind them, the observer on the mezzanine lifted a radio to his mouth and murmured a few quick words before disappearing into the stairwell. Karen didn't see it. His focus remained where it had always been, from the start of this long day, to ensure his son boarded safely. But in the invisible network around them, gears had already begun to turn. And as he handed the completed form back to Redden with a courteous nod, Karen had no idea just how carefully this moment had been arranged. Because storms rarely announce themselves before they break. The scanner light above gate 17A pulsed steadily as Karen Vance wheeled his son Darius toward the boarding line. The airport sounds around them dimming beneath a growing sense of unease. Karen's eyes swept the area, always scanning, always prepared. He held in his hand a neatly organized folder containing Darius's medical clearance, special mobility certification, and seating documents, everything required for priority boarding and in-flight accommodation. He handed the file to the station gate officer, a tall man with pale features and narrowed eyes, whose badge read, Redden Vorse. Redden barely glanced at the documents, tapping mindlessly at his tablet. "We may need to reassess this," he muttered, not meeting Karen's eyes. He tapped again once, twice, then paused, stalling. Karen tilted his head slightly. "The documents are complete and current," he said evenly. "We've pre-cleared with the flight manifest and accessibility review." Redden nodded vaguely, but said nothing, scrolling through something on the screen for far longer than seemed necessary. Karen noticed the man wasn't reading. He was waiting. Unbeknownst to Karen, a message had been transmitted to Redden just minutes before. Flag 4A? Apply friction. Watch for reaction. Log delay. It came from higher up, a system of pressure tactics hidden in routine protocol. Redden tapped again and then looked up with manufactured uncertainty. "It's just unusual seating dynamics," he said cryptically. "We'll need to verify again." Karen remained composed, though Darius was already fidgeting in the chair. "Is something wrong?" the boy asked quietly, adjusting the soft brace wrapped around his recovering leg. Karen gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're fine," he said. "Just procedural delay." But the delay wasn't procedural. It was engineered. A new presence stepped into the frame, leaning against the adjacent counter, arms crossed, a half-smile playing on his lips. Orvin Lusk, the lead flight attendant for Flight Virion 813, wore the posture of a man who saw rules as tools, bendable, wieldable. He strolled forward slowly, his eyes narrowing on Darius's medical wheelchair as if it were a personal offense. "What's the nature of his injury?" Orvin asked abruptly, his tone neither gentle nor professional. Karen's voice was calm. "Post-surgical stabilization." The brace prevents strain during cabin pressure changes. It's documented in the clearance. Orvin made a show of examining the seal on the wheelchair frame, fingers brushing it as if testing its legitimacy. Interesting, he said slowly, dragging out the word. You know, sometimes these things are exaggerated for special treatment. Karen blinked once, then met his eyes directly. I'll assume that's not an accusation. Orvin's lips twitched in a smile. Then he leaned slightly, lowering his voice just enough to veil the venom in it. Some passengers get special treatment, but not all deserve it. The words hung in the air like a toxin. Before Karen could respond, the boarding announcement echoed overhead. Now boarding, pre-clearance passengers with medical exemptions. Karen turned toward the wheelchair ramp door, motioning Darius forward. But Orvin blocked the entrance with one deliberate step, arms folded, face calm. Quick question, he said. Are you sure your son can handle turbulence? We're expecting some at cruising. Karen kept his voice low and controlled. He has handled international airspace during recovery. I don't see how this flight would differ. Orvin raised an eyebrow as if he doubted the response. Well, sometimes strain gets worse at altitude. You know how kids can overreact to pressure changes. From the mezzanine above, a figure observed quietly. A man in a navy vest leaned against the rail with calculated stillness, watching the interaction below. When Orvin spoke, the man nodded once, subtle approval that went unnoticed by the crowd, but not by Karen, who caught the movement in his peripheral vision. He looked up instinctively, but the man shifted away, disappearing behind a wall column. At the gate podium, Redden cleared his throat. It seems we're missing the original boarding assistance form. I'll need you to complete a new one. Karen frowned. You had it 5 minutes ago. I'm not seeing it now. Redden replied with a shrug that felt more like a taunt than confusion. He pushed a blank digital form across the counter. Karen could feel it now, pressure from multiple angles. Subtle, measured, precise. It wasn't just incompetence. It was coordinated. He sat down beside Darius, who looked confused. Did we do something wrong? The boy asked. No, Karen said gently, beginning to fill the form again. But it seems they're testing how we respond when things go wrong. He submitted the second form, making sure to scan and save a timestamp copy to his private server, just in case. Redden accepted it without a word and handed back their boarding passes with a sterile nod. Karen wheeled Darius forward again, and this time Orvin stepped aside with feigned politeness. Safe travels, he said, but the smirk on his lips made the words sound like a warning. Karen's mind raced, not with panic, but calculation. Every interaction felt rehearsed. Every obstacle too synchronized to be random. The man above, the sudden form loss, the invasive questioning. It wasn't paranoia. It was precision. He said nothing as they finally proceeded down the ramp. But in his silence, he was already documenting, already watching, already preparing. What Orvin and Redden didn't know was that Karen had been trained to handle high-stakes strategy under pressure. What they didn't expect was that he wouldn't break. And what none of them knew was that their provocation wouldn't just lead to conflict. It would pull the curtain back on something far deeper than either of them had been authorized to reveal. This composure was exactly what made the unseen orchestrators uneasy, planting seeds for an escalation Orvin would soon take too far. And patience, when misunderstood, becomes fuel for those who misjudge it. When Karen and Darius finally reached the aircraft door, Orvin Lusk stood in front of it like a gatekeeper guarding a threshold, arms folded and eyes already narrowed with intent. There was no trace of a smile or professional courtesy. Instead, his expression held the same rigid suspicion he had shown at the gate, only now amplified, as if he had been waiting for this moment to deliver a specific blow. I need to conduct a final safety reassessment, Orvin announced in a voice just loud enough for passengers nearby to hear. His tone carried the weight of authority, yet lacked sincerity. Karen stopped, one hand still on the wheelchair handle, and angled his body slightly to shield Darius, whose eyes were already widening with unease. The clearance has already been given, Karen replied firmly, holding out the documentation again. It's been approved through both the gate officer and ground medical. Orvin didn't even glance at the documents. Instead, he stepped forward, eyes fixed on Darius's leg. For safety purposes, he said, the child must demonstrate independent mobility. If he can't stand unaided, we need to evaluate whether he should be flying at all. Karen's expression didn't change, but a current of warning rippled beneath his calm voice. He has a surgical brace. Asking him to stand would risk tearing internal stitches. I won't allow that. Passengers behind them began to murmur, confused and impatient. A line was forming. A few voices asked what the delay was, and one man near the back called out, "Is there a problem up there?" Orvin raised a hand without turning around. "Safety procedure, sir. Please remain in line." Karen didn't move. Neither did Darius, who sat quietly, one hand gripping the side of the chair with white knuckles. He didn't speak, but the fear in his eyes was clear. The moment grew heavier. Then, from the galley entrance just inside the aircraft, a figure appeared, tall, suited in navy, and speaking softly into Orvin's ear. Karen couldn't hear the words, but he saw Orvin's eyes flick sideways in response. The man's presence was fleeting. After delivering his message, he turned and disappeared into the cabin shadows, as if never there. Orvin took a breath, then suddenly lunged forward and grabbed the wheelchair handles. "Let's make sure this is secure," he said loudly, feigning concern. Before Karen could stop him, Orvin yanked the chair back with a sharp, testing motion. The wheels screeched softly against the floor. Darius gasped, a sound that sliced through the air. Pain shot through his leg like fire, and his hands instinctively went to his knee. "Stop," Karen said, stepping between them. "That's enough." But Orvin was already stepping back, face neutral. "Just confirming structural integrity," he said flatly. Karen crouched beside his son, checking the brace, the skin around it, the breath in Darius's chest. The boy was trembling now, fighting back tears, his head lowered. Passengers had grown silent, unsure of what they had just witnessed. From the jump seat inside the aircraft, trainee flight attendant Arvin Kell sat stiffly, hands gripping his lap belt. His eyes had tracked every motion. It was clear to him this wasn't standard procedure. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Fear of retaliation coiled around his conscience. Still, he reached for his tablet and quietly began documenting what he had seen. Karen stood again, his voice measured but iron. "We will document everything," he said, his tone aimed at both Orvin and anyone listening. "I strongly recommend you review protocol before proceeding." Orvin didn't flinch. In fact, he smiled faintly, as if Karen's restraint confirmed something he had hoped for. Around them, passengers began pulling out phones. A quiet chorus of chimes and camera shutters broke the silence. Someone whispered, "I got that," while another nodded toward friend, indicating they were already filming. Arvin Kell's heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. He could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down like cabin pressure. Orvin's stance shifted, feet braced, jaw clenched, hands twitching slightly. He hadn't gotten the outburst he was baiting for. Not yet. Darius, still seated, whispered hoarsely, "Dad, let's just go back." Karen turned his head slightly and whispered, "We're not going anywhere. You've done nothing wrong." But Orvin wasn't done. His need to provoke had transformed into desperation. The cameras were now a threat he hadn't accounted for. His original strategy had been derailed by Karen's calm, by the passenger's eyes, by Arvin's quiet documentation. Orvin stepped forward again, his body language impatient. "If the child can't demonstrate safe boarding, we'll need to remove him for secondary evaluation," he said, too loudly, as if trying to trigger a response. "You touch this chair again," Karen said, stepping between them, "and I promise the consequences will not be administrative." There was a moment, sharp and suspended, where time seemed to wait. Then Orvin did something subtle but telling. He glanced once more toward the empty galley where the observer had stood, as if expecting backup. But no one was there. That's when Arvin, on the jump seat, slowly stood. "Sir," he called, his voice thin but clear. "This doesn't feel like protocol. I think you should step back." Orvin turned, startled, the confidence draining for just a beat. "Return to your station, Kell. Now." Arvin didn't move. His eyes darted to Karen, then to the passengers, then back to Orvin. They're recording. Everyone's watching. For the first time, Orvin's hands curled into fists, not in preparation for violence, but from the sheer pressure of being seen. Karen placed a gentle hand on Darius's shoulder, grounding him again, protecting what mattered most. The cabin air had thickened. The aisle was frozen. The tension no longer belonged to one father and one crew member. It belonged to the entire plane. And still, Orvin stood there, needing anything to happen that would shift the blame, invite chaos, justify control. But nothing came. Only silence. Only cameras. Only witnesses. Only the faint hum of an aircraft door that had yet to close. And somewhere beyond the visible, the observer who had whispered orders was already retreating. Desperation had taken root and was about to bloom, and desperation makes dangerous men careless. Orvin's hand moved with sharp intent. With no warning, he gripped the wheelchair's handlebars and snapped the frame forward. The force was brutal. The metal frame tipped violently. In an instant too fast for protest, Darius's body flew forward with it, flung from the safety of the seat as if discarded baggage. His braced leg caught the floor first with a sickening sound, part impact, part the scream that tore from his chest as he hit the aisle hard. Gasps erupted through the cabin like thunder. Passengers jolted in their seats, some rising in panic. The hum of pre-flight quiet shattered into cries of disbelief. "Dad!" Darius howled, curling his small frame instinctively toward his injured leg. His braces had twisted on impact. His arms clutched at the pain, trying to find a way to stop it from spreading, but it was no use. Karen was already on the floor. He hadn't even realized his knees had buckled. His instincts had hurled him down beside his son before his mind could catch up. "Darius, breathe. Look at me," he said quickly, his voice trembling but firm, eyes scanning the leg. The swelling had started. Fast. Too fast. The cabin lights stayed steady. No turbulence. No motion. No justification. Across the aisle, a man dropped his travel pillow, stood up shakily, and fumbled for his phone. Another reached above for the light button, but instead hit record. One after another, camera lenses lifted. Angles were caught. Footage began. Passengers whispered the same word, "Why?" Orvin, now standing frozen beside the upended wheelchair, stammered. There was movement. I thought it was unstable. His voice was brittle, the kind of voice that knows it's about to fracture. He looked around as if someone would come to back him up, to echo the excuse, to soften the truth. But the silence that followed was damning. From the jump seat, Arvin Kell shot to his feet. The trainee's hands were shaking, but his voice cracked with conviction. "Stop! You can't do that!" His eyes flicked from Darius's curled frame to the faces of the other passengers, then back to Orvin. That wasn't protocol. Orvin turned toward him, something unreadable in his eyes, fear or fury, or both. But Arvin didn't back down. He stood there, as if the weight of decency had finally risen in him too loud to ignore. Karen gently slipped one hand under Darius's shoulder, the other beneath the brace leg, supporting it just enough to prevent further movement. Darius whimpered, sweat already lining his forehead. Karen's voice dropped, low and cold. "You assaulted a recovering child." Orvin took a step back. "It was an accident," he repeated, but the words sounded hollow now. No one believed him. He knew it. Karen knew it. And the cameras had caught too much for the lie to hold. Passengers were already shouting for a doctor. One man pushed the call button repeatedly, his face red with anger. Another stood and gestured toward the front. "Get the captain. Now!" In the corner of Karen's vision, something moved, subtle, almost invisible. A man in a Navy airport vest, the same one Karen had glimpsed before, slipped quietly from the galley and vanished up the narrow hallway leading to the service bay. No words, no hesitation. Just gone. The pattern sharpened in Karen's mind. This wasn't random. It had been provoked. Engineered. Arvin kneeled beside them now. "I'll get the medical kit," he said. His voice was tight, jaw clenched, ashamed. Karen nodded once. His own heart was a riot of fury and restraint, but Darius came first. He kept his voice soft. "It's okay, son. I'm here. We've got you." In the doorway, Orvin stood stiffly, eyes flicking between Karen and the cabin, as if calculating a way to reframe the moment. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Whatever script he had prepared, it no longer applied. Karen spoke again, not shouting, not pleading, but sharp enough to draw blood. "Get your captain. Now." A junior attendant disappeared toward the cockpit, pale-faced. The cabin fell into a strange kind of silence, part reverence, part disbelief. No one spoke, but everyone watched. A man from row 6 leaned into the aisle and said, loud enough for the back rows to hear, "I've got it all. My phone's recording since the gate." Karen didn't look up. He didn't need to. He already knew the game had shifted. As he cradled Darius carefully in his arms, gently adjusting the boy's position to relieve the pressure from the swollen leg, a cold resolve settled over him. The truth had teeth now. It had evidence. And it had witnesses. Orvin backed into the galley, shoulders trembling, eyes wide. The captain hadn't even arrived yet, but the damage had already been done. Karen stood slowly, still holding Darius, whose breaths came in short, pained gasps. Every eye in the cabin followed him. He faced the aisle, jaw clenched, spine straight. His voice was low but final. "This ends now." And sometimes, a single reckless moment unlocks a truth no one intended to reveal. Chaos rippled through the cabin the instant Darius hit the floor. Gasps erupted from every row, the collective noise of outrage and disbelief slicing through the recycled air like a blade. Karen Vance was already down on one knee, his arms scooping his injured son close as Darius cried out, hands clutching his leg where the surgical brace had twisted unnaturally. The boy's face contorted in pain, his voice thin and sharp. Karen's heart clenched, but his face remained composed, tightened, but not broken. "Shoo, I've got you, son," he whispered, steadying his voice not just for Darius, but for himself. His mind surged with calculations, pain level, brace displacement, possible re-tear. The priority was immediate care, but the fury behind his calm was rapidly building. Commander Relon Tharn entered like a thundercloud. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always crisp in tone and posture, the captain wasted no time. "What happened here?" he demanded, eyes flicking from Darius's trembling frame to Orvin Lusk, who stood 2 paces back, frozen with a defensive stance that only deepened suspicion. "There was turbulence," Orvin muttered, his voice weak against the storm rising in the cabin. "No," came another voice, clear, firm, and shaking with risk. It was Arvin Kell, the trainee. He stepped forward from his jump seat, fists clenched at his sides. "Sir, there was no turbulence." Orvin grabbed the chair. He flipped it. A hush fell. Karen's gaze lifted, cool and sharp. Without a word, he raised his hand toward the nearest passenger holding out a phone. The screen glowed as it played the footage in silence. Orvin jerking the wheelchair, Darius flying forward, the crack of metal, the scream. Relon watched, unmoving, until the clip ended. His jaw clenched. "Crew member Lusk," he said, tone hard as steel, "return to the galley." "Now." Orvin hesitated. He resisted. The child now. The finality in Relon's voice left no room for defiance. In the back of the cabin, unnoticed by most, a man wearing a navy blue airport operations badge adjusted the mic on his collar and whispered into an earpiece. "The incident happened earlier than expected," he said. His name tag read, Varric Solon. Karen caught the movement in his periphery, but didn't linger on it. His focus was Darius, whose face had paled, teeth clenched against the pain. Swelling was already visible beneath the brace's edge. "I need medical evaluation now," Karen said. It was not a plea. It was a demand low and precise. Relon responded with a sharp nod. "I'm halting departure. We'll get emergency support on board immediately." A ripple of motion passed through the crew. A few passengers were still filming. Others murmured in disbelief. A child had been hurt, and not by accident. Orvin lingered by the galley, pacing like a cornered animal. His story, thin and cracking, was no match for the growing pile of visual proof. Still, Karen noticed him glancing sideways, not at the passengers, not at the captain, but toward Varric Solon, who now leaned against a panel near the cockpit, seemingly casual, but too interested. Karen's instincts flared. There was a connection here, one he couldn't name yet, but it pulsed beneath the surface like a live wire. Relon approached once more, crouching beside Karen and Darius. Medical crews, 5 minutes out. We'll hold the jetway for as long as necessary. Karen nodded, shifting Darius gently to a more stable position. The boy's breathing was shallow, lips pale. I'm here, Karen murmured. I won't let them touch you again. From across the aisle, Arvin stood awkwardly, guilt flickering in his eyes. He wanted to say more, but Karen gave him a short nod. Not now. The truth would come later. In the meantime, the cabin door opened again. A security marshal peeked inside, summoned by Relon's earlier call. Karen didn't rise, but his voice cut through the cabin, even and undeniable. Commander, I want a full incident record preserved. Passenger footage, crew logs, and that man's name. He nodded toward Varric Solon. Relon followed his gaze and narrowed his eyes. Understood. In the cabin's far corner, Varric turned and casually stepped away, speaking softly again into his mic. No one stopped him yet. Karen held Darius tighter as the pain in his son's leg throbbed through every breath. My son's safety comes first, he said, unaware that saying those words out loud would activate consequences far beyond medical concerns. Because in some systems, truth is not what they fear, it is what they cannot let escape. The moment Darius hit the floor, everything shifted. Gasps burst through the cabin like a cracked pressure valve. The boy's scream tore through the narrow aisle, sharp, pained, real. Karen dropped to his knees beside him, his breath tight as he slid an arm under Darius's back, the other cradling his son's braced leg. Darius was trembling, sweat beading along his forehead, one hand gripping Karen's jacket. The swelling was already visible through the medical brace. Something inside had been pulled or torn again. Footsteps pounded up the aisle. Captain Relon Tharn arrived, his face taut with unspoken fury, eyes sweeping across the stunned cabin. What happened here? He demanded. Orvin Lusk was already backing away from the scene, face pale, arms rigid. He lifted one hand defensively. Turbulence hit. The chair wasn't secured. The child slipped. No turbulence, came a voice from the rear. Relon turned. It was Arvin Kell, the trainee, standing halfway down the aisle. His voice trembled but didn't break. There was no motion. We haven't moved an inch. Orvin flipped the chair forward. On purpose. Karen looked up, meeting Relon's eyes. He attacked my son. I have witnesses. Footage. Relon didn't hesitate. He turned to the nearest attendant. Get ground medics. Now, secure the footage from any passengers willing to share. Then, stepping toward Orvin, his voice dropped into steel. You will speak only when asked. Orvin stiffened. I was following protocol. You were not, Relon snapped. And you will remain in the galley until security arrives. Darius whimpered as a spasm of pain crossed his face. Karen leaned closer. I'm here, Darius. I've got you. Just breathe. From the galley, Orvin's voice rose again, desperate now. You can't arrest me. Protocol allows restraint during emergencies. Relon's voice came colder than before. Not when you created the emergency. The back cabin doors opened, and 2 medical personnel boarded with urgency. One of them, a tall, soft-spoken man named Jaron Vale, immediately knelt beside Karen and Darius. His movements were precise, practiced. Tell me everything, he said quietly, opening his medical scanner. Karen nodded, voice controlled. Post-operative knee surgery. Braced. Stable until now. Impact trauma from forward wheelchair tip. Jaron examined the leg. His fingers probed around the brace, gently. Swelling's rapid. I need to scan. Passengers leaned out of the way as Jaron activated his device. The pale blue light swept across Darius's leg. Jaron's face tightened. Ligament tension compromised. Possibly internal tearing. He needs imaging immediately. Karen's jaw set. Then let's go. Relon tapped his badge and radioed to dispatch. Evac protocol. We're halting departure. His tone didn't invite discussion. In the meantime, Orvin sat in the galley's jump seat, his composure unraveling. Sweat marked his collar, hands tapping anxiously on his knees. He turned toward the cockpit, just in time to see another man quietly repositioning near the crew's tablet station. It was Varric Solon. Karen didn't notice him, his attention locked on Darius, but Varric stood with false casualness, tapping through flight logs, then subtly swiping into a secondary menu only senior operations staff could access. The screen displayed encrypted files and contract routing systems. Varric's eyes narrowed as he navigated to an entry labeled Vance Gen, Tier 3 Intervention Index. He tapped, then closed the screen. Arvin Kell approached Karen, his face pale but determined. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "I don't know if this helps, but—" Orvin wasn't acting alone. He kept checking messages on the crew tablet. "I saw him. It wasn't just him." Karen looked up sharply. "Who sent the messages?" Arvin shook his head. "I don't know." But he wasn't improvising. Someone was feeding him instructions. The words hung in the air like a new fracture in the cabin's ceiling. Karen placed a steady hand on Arvin's shoulder. "Thank you. That takes courage." Relon joined them, nodding toward the medical team. "They're ready to transfer. Security's en route." Karen rose, lifting Darius gently into his arms as Jaren supported the brace. The medic's voice was low but firm. "We'll stabilize en route, then straight to imaging." Just then, 2 uniformed security officers entered through the forward hatch. Relon stepped aside and pointed to Orvin. "He's to be held pending inquiry. Log all statements, and keep him away from his family." Orvin stood abruptly. "This is insane. I'm the one being punished for doing my job." "You were never trained to throw a child," Relon said bluntly. As the officers approached, Orvin's gaze darted to the cockpit, to the galley, and finally, briefly, to Varric Solon. It was a half-second glance, but Karen caught it. The look, quick, almost instinctive, wasn't one of random recognition. It was coded, familiar, and Varric, still standing near the crew tablet, met it with an unreadable nod before stepping back, as if blending into the flight operations staff. Karen's eyes narrowed, but there was no time to unpack it. The medic was moving, Darius wincing with each bump as they guided him toward the cabin exit. Orvin was led in the opposite direction, now shouting, "You'll all regret this. You don't understand who's really in charge." Karen looked back only once, toward the cockpit where Varric had stood seconds earlier. But the man was gone. The crew tablet screen was dark. As they exited the plane, the rush of the terminal's sterile air hit like a wall. Emergency staff awaited. Behind them, the cabin remained in stunned silence. A quiet storm had passed, but another was forming, one Karen now realized had roots far deeper than a single act of misconduct. And when shadows move in silence, they often reveal themselves only when someone shines a brighter light. Karen sat rigid beside the medical bed as Darius winced under the scanner's gentle hum. The bright lights above cast sterile shadows across the room, illuminating every detail in sharp contrast. The cold glint of surgical tools, the antiseptic scent that clung to the air, the muted beeping of equipment tracking Darius's vitals. His son's face was pale, jaw clenched, tears drying against his temple. Jaren Vale, the attending medic, carefully examined the screen as image slices formed in real time. Then his eyes narrowed. "There's new tearing in the soft tissue," Jaren said, voice calm but grave. "The impact has compromised the healing site. He'll need immediate intervention." Karen's gaze dropped to his son's bandaged leg. For a long second, he said nothing. Then he drew in a breath through his nose and exhaled slowly, calculating, steady, but beneath that calm, fury brewed like a rising tide. Before he could speak, the door opened with a quiet hiss. A tall man in a deep gray uniform stepped inside, Security Officer Brennick. His posture was crisp, his face unreadable. He carried a sleek tablet, the kind issued only to mid-level tribunal liaisons. "Dr. Vance," Brennick said, offering a clipped nod. "We need your official statement for the investigation." Karen didn't stand. He placed a hand on Darius's shoulder, then gestured for Brennick to proceed. "I've already archived time-stamped footage," Karen said. witness names, passenger seat numbers, and the original medical exemption file that Orvin ignored. Brennick gave a quiet hum of approval and began reviewing Orvin Lusk's personnel record. His expression tightened as he scrolled. 3 write-ups for escalation-related conduct, he muttered. All within the past year. All resolved within 24 hours. Karen's head tilted. Resolved by whom? Brennick paused. His thumb hovered over the screen before tapping once to expand the clearance records. Varric Solon, he said. Airport Executive Controller. At that moment, Darius stirred. Dad. His voice was soft, strained. That was the guy near the cockpit. The one pretending to help. Karen's eyes narrowed. The image of the man with the operations badge, standing too calmly, watching too closely, rose clearly now in his memory. Until that second, he had assumed this was an incident caused by a single reckless attendant. Now the shape of something larger, something colder, was forming. Brennick set the tablet down on the instrument tray, leaning slightly closer. Varric's known for aggressive contract renegotiation tactics, he explained. High-pressure strategies, escalation scenarios, shadow influence over select flight staff. Nothing that's ever triggered a formal tribunal. But he's been under silent review by airport oversight for suspected manipulation of internal personnel. Karen didn't answer immediately. He turned back toward Jaren, who had begun securing Darius's leg with a temporary stabilization brace, his movements precise and quiet. How long before he can be moved? Karen asked. Less than 10 minutes. But the swelling is increasing. I recommend imaging follow-ups at the medical wing downtown. Karen gave a small nod. Then he turned back to Brennick, his voice quiet but charged with force. Then we don't have much time to get ahead of whoever planned this. Brennick didn't flinch. We're pulling communications from all personnel tablets. If Orvin received external instructions, we'll trace the source. And if Solon authorized any override during boarding, it'll be on record. Jaren finished his task and gently rested a blanket over Darius. The boy's eyes were already growing heavier from the pain medication, but he turned slightly toward his father. Why'd they do it? Darius asked faintly. I didn't do anything. Karen leaned in, brushing back a strand of hair from his son's forehead. You didn't, he said softly. But they did, and they will answer for it. In the corner, Brennick activated a data link, feeding Orvin's personnel files directly into a tribunal channel. Meanwhile, Karen stood, his mind turning sharper by the second. No longer was this about one flight, or even one reckless employee. The pieces aligned too cleanly: Orvin's aggression, Varric's oversight clearance, the forced delay at the gate, the whisper of leverage hanging in every misstep. He looked once more at the door. This wasn't sabotage. It was strategy, and someone had weaponized his son's presence to execute it. For in the quiet corners of authority, power often steps beyond its own rules. Karen had just stepped past the terminal checkpoint, Darius supported gently under his arm, when a sharply dressed man in a navy gray blazer approached with 2 silent legal advisors flanking him. The man's ID tag read, Halden Rurik, Director of Internal Oversight. His tone was clipped and firm. Dr. Vance, we need to speak in private. It's urgent. Karen didn't reply immediately. His mind, already taut with emotional tension, analyzed Halden's body language. No hostility, but no room for refusal. Darius looked up, confused. Karen glanced at the medical staff nearby. Please stay with my son, he said, then turned back to Halden. Let's go. They moved swiftly through a security-restricted corridor, past sliding glass panels that sealed behind them with a quiet hiss. The private conference room they entered was clean and sterile, its only furniture a central table surrounded by frosted walls. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting everything in a pale, almost surgical glow. One of the legal aides locked the door behind them. Without ceremony, Halden placed a manila folder on the table and slid it toward Karen. Do you recognize this? He asked. Karen opened it, expecting a procedural document, maybe something to do with Orvin's arrest or a formal complaint trail. But his eyes stopped cold on the first page. The letterhead wasn't from the airline. It was from the Valor Airport Commercial Authority. And the second line underneath carried the stamp of something far more troubling. Subject, Strategic Monitoring Initiative, Priority Negotiation Subject. Vance, Karen, Vance Gen Systems. The words hit him like a cold wave. He skimmed the rest, legalese, scheduling notes, operational memos, until the implication became crystal clear. Certain airport personnel had been instructed to monitor him, not for safety, not for his son's welfare, but to gain leverage in an upcoming contract negotiation between the airport and his company, Vance Gen Systems, which had been supplying advanced biomonitoring devices for terminal clinics. His fists tightened around the folder. Halden stepped closer. Varric Solon organized it. He tried to use your presence here today to trigger what's called a compliance incident. If successful, it would have allowed his department to claim that your travel violated unstated terms of your vendor clause, essentially giving them an excuse to reopen the entire supply contract. Karen's face remained calm, but his voice turned glacial. By targeting my son? Halden exhaled heavily. Orvin wasn't supposed to go that far. According to our internal briefings, the plan was only to delay your boarding, cause enough discomfort that you'd respond emotionally. They were counting on a confrontation they could twist into noncompliance, something to void the existing contract. Karen stared at the document again, heart hammering beneath a polished surface. His son's cries on the cabin floor, the fall, the pain, and all of it was a calculated chess move? I need you to understand something, Halden said, pulling out a secondary folder. This was never just about one flight. Solon had been pushing for renegotiation power for months. Your company's refusal to grant exclusive diagnostics rights frustrated a lot of internal stakeholders. Stakeholders, Karen echoed bitterly. So the 12-year-old boy became a bargaining chip. Halden's tone lowered. Worse, a test case. But Solon miscalculated. Orvin's aggression went off script. He wasn't supposed to flip the wheelchair. That wasn't approved. Now the incident has escalated into a medical emergency, and what was once internal leverage has crossed into federal criminal manipulation. Karen didn't speak for a moment. His thoughts flicked back to Darius, his small hands gripping his father's coat, the tremor in his voice, the confusion in his eyes as pain rippled through his leg. Why tell me this now? He asked, gaze sharp. Halden nodded toward the folder. Because whether you pursue it or not, this will explode. The footage is already in tribunal hands. And Solon made a critical error. He logged messages through a traceable internal channel. We have timestamps, IP markers. The paper trail is real. If you choose to take this beyond internal arbitration, you'll have every legal ground to force a full ethics audit of our operational leadership, including Halavar's oversight office. Karen raised an eyebrow. Halevar. Counselor Rendick Halevar, Halden confirmed. He chairs funding for the airport's vendor oversight board. He's been pushing for a central contract revision clause that would give his office more discretion over supplier eligibility. Solon's operation may have been his idea, at least in spirit. Karen's jaw clenched. Director Rurik, he said calmly, you came to me now because you're not protecting Solon anymore. You're protecting the structure around him. Halden didn't deny it. The structure isn't sustainable if it crumbles from one incident. Karen slowly pushed the folder back. Then it's time it did. He stood. Halden didn't stop him. Instead, he spoke with something close to respect. This is no longer an internal problem, Dr. Vance. This is criminal manipulation. Karen turned toward the exit, already calculating his next steps, not just as a father seeking justice, but as a CEO who had just seen behind the curtain of a system that believed it could exploit innocence in the name of profit. And when a plan meant to pressure a man instead exposes a larger truth, the path to justice becomes impossible to bury. The attendant smirked, confident his cruelty would go unpunished, unaware that every signature, every clause, and every executive decision had already been lined up to reverse the humiliation. If you believe abuse under privilege always folds when strategy meets power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Director Halden Rurik led Karen into the secure inquiry chamber without ceremony. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the world out. The room was cloaked in a quiet tension, the kind that doesn't shout but weighs down like invisible pressure. The walls were padded for confidentiality, the air just cool enough to keep minds alert. At the far end, a wide display screen was already active. Darius lay nearby on a medical cot, his eyes barely open, a blanket draped across his lap. Karen never let go of his hand. He sat upright, sharp-eyed, calm on the surface, but there was steel beneath. 3 officials entered next: Tribunal Officer Sarenvale, Contract Auditor Dallamaris, and Behavioral Compliance Chief Jorn Havek. Each man took his place without small talk. These weren't administrators anymore. They were judges about to weigh the cost of a child's pain. "We'll begin," Halden said simply. The lights dimmed slightly. On screen, passenger footage began playing in synchronized clips. It showed the moment Orvin Lusk flipped the wheelchair with shocking force. Darius's scream, raw and sudden, echoed through the room like a blade on glass. The video paused with Darius on the floor, Karen's hands already reaching for him. No one spoke. Saren exhaled through his nose, writing deliberate notes as if the pen might puncture the paper. Dallin blinked several times, then tapped a key on his console. "There's more," Dallin said, pulling up internal system logs. Minutes before that moment, Varric Solon accessed the flight manifest and manually flagged Row 4A, Karen Vance's row, for heightened observation. Karen's brows furrowed. "He selected me?" "Not just you," Dallin replied. He reviewed Orvin's crew profile. "We cross-checked timestamps." Jorn Havek leaned forward and tapped on his own screen. "This is the part you need to see." A new document appeared, labeled PBR 22, a predictive behavioral report. Orvin was flagged 6 months ago. Jorn explained, voice flat. He scored high on escalation risk under pressure. He had previous outbursts with passengers. One case involved verbal intimidation of a father traveling with a disabled teen. It was buried. Karen stared at the report, his jaw tightening. So they used the one person most likely to lose control. Jorn nodded gravely. Precisely. Solon didn't just choose randomly. He picked the most volatile match. Halden's expression remained stone still, but his fingers twitched as he leaned forward. "Karen, this wasn't accidental." Orvin was activated. The silence that followed was thick with understanding. From the cot, Darius stirred weakly. "Dad, I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered, his voice barely above the mechanical hum of the nearby monitor. Karen turned instantly, brushing his son's hair back gently. "You didn't," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "But they did." Saren stood abruptly and walked to the terminal mounted on the sidewall. "I'm issuing an immediate detainment order for Varric Solon. He needs to answer for this." As he began typing, the screen suddenly flashed. An alert pulsed across the interface. "Subject Varric Solon has left the premises." "What?" Halden barked, stepping closer. "He's gone," Saren confirmed grimly. "He accessed a restricted terminal exit 20 minutes ago, just before we initiated this review." Dallin muttered. He knew it was coming. Karen's hands clenched against the side of the cot. "He was never planning to stay. He used my son to stage an event and slipped away before the consequences." Jorn checked his communicator. "We'll initiate a lockdown sweep. All terminals, all sectors." But the damage had been done. The very man who had marked Karen as a leverage target, who had chosen Orvin as the tool of provocation, was now beyond reach, at least for the moment. The truth had stirred something larger than any of them expected. Karen rose to his feet slowly, casting one last look at the paused image on screen, his son on the floor, eyes wide, pain visible, truth undeniable. He turned to the room, his voice calm but sharpened by resolve. "This isn't just an abuse of power. It's a system trained to hide harm behind protocol." Halden met his gaze. "And now we dismantle it." But Karen said nothing more. He simply returned to Darius's side, his fingers wrapping once more around his son's small hand. The doors remained closed, the air still heavy. But the silence had shifted from passive tension to active resolve. And as security officers outside began mobilizing, Karen knew the game had changed. Now it was not just about justice, it was about finding the root before others were harmed. And when the truth corners the guilty, they rarely stay to watch justice close in. Part 10. expanded, fully developed chapter. The alert struck the room like a sudden crack of thunder. Unauthorized personnel detected in the logistics hangar. The announcement echoed through the investigation wing, cutting through the low hum of voices and the steady beeping of nearby medical monitors. Karen's head snapped up immediately. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the sharp pull of decision. For a moment, it felt as though the entire airport paused around him, hanging on the next choice he would make. Darius lay on the medical cot beside him, his legs stabilized in a temporary brace, his breathing shallow but steady. Karen reached out instinctively, resting a gentle hand on his son's arm. The boy's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the alarm, confusion sharpening into realization. "Dad," he whispered, voice fragile yet unwavering. "They found him, didn't they?" Karen nodded once, the motion tight with internal conflict. He wanted nothing more than to stay with Darius, to ensure he was safe, protected, comforted. But the truth pressed against him like a closing wall. Someone had turned his son into leverage, and until that person was stopped, danger remained rooted in the system itself. Before Karen could respond, the door burst open and Halden Rurik stepped back in, his expression severe. "We have visual confirmation," Halden said, breath clipped with urgency. Varric Solon forced entry into the logistics hangar. Brennick Rowell is moving to intercept him now. His voice dropped lower. "Dr. Vance, this may be your only chance to confront the man who set all of this in motion." Karen's gaze shifted between Halden and Darius, torn cleanly in two. A storm brewed behind his eyes, anger for what had been done, fear for what might still happen, and determination carved from something deeper. Darius, despite the pain and exhaustion clouding his features, tightened his grip on Karen's wrist. "Go," he said quietly but firmly. "You have to end it." The words struck Karen with unexpected force. Darius's voice, shaken but brave, felt like the last piece he needed to make the decision he already knew was right. Karen stood, adjusting his coat with a steadying breath. "Stay with Jaren," he instructed Darius softly. "He won't leave your side." Darius nodded, trusting his father completely. As Karen stepped into the hallway, the lighting seemed harsher, the air colder. The corridor buzzed with activity, officers running toward exits, analysts shouting updates, screens flashing warnings in bold red text. Every movement felt urgent, every sound sharpened by the tension coiled within the building. Tribunal Officer Saren Vale jogged alongside him, tablet in hand. "We cross-referenced the message Solon received," Saren said, breath uneven. "It wasn't random. Someone tried to time this incident to match an internal authority review. If it had gone through uncontested, it would have rewritten half the supplier contracts." Karen felt his jaw clench. The manipulation ran deeper than he'd imagined. This wasn't a personal attack alone. It was a calculated attempt to pressure companies through orchestrated conflict. "Who sent it?" he demanded. Saren shook his head, still tracing it. But whoever it was, they outranked Solon. Dramatic irony settled like a shadow behind them. Karen had entered the airport expecting a flight, not realizing he was stepping into a trap built layer by layer above his awareness. Now he was walking through the architecture of that trap, seeing the walls clearly for the first time. As they reached the intersection leading to the logistics wing, Dallin Maris approached, pale and shaken, holding a folder thick with printed contract logs. "Dr. Vance," Dallin said, voice trembling slightly. "These amendments Solon inserted, they weren't just irregular. They were designed to target specific individuals. People who refused to cooperate. People like you." The realization chilled Karen to his core. He had underestimated the stakes. They weren't simply using him to pressure Vance Jen. They were building a system that weaponized compliance itself. And Darius had been caught in the crossfire of that system. Halden pointed toward a heavy steel door ahead. "The hangar is this way. Brennick has him cornered, but we don't know how long that will hold." For a moment, Karen paused, closing his eyes briefly. He allowed himself one breath, to gather focus, to steady the unrest inside him, to sharpen his purpose. Then he opened his eyes again, clearer, harder, resolved. He stepped through the steel door as it slid open with a low mechanical grind. The logistics corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit, echoing with the distant sounds of footsteps and intermittent radio chatter. The air smelled of metal, fuel, and cold storage. Karen moved forward quickly, boots hitting the concrete with purpose. He didn't run, but there was no hesitation in his stride. Midway down the passage, Brennick's voice crackled over the intercom again. "We found Solon." Karen froze for half a heartbeat, the words settling into his bones. His decision was made. There was no turning back, no waiting for someone else to resolve what had been forced upon him. He turned his head slightly, speaking more to himself than anyone else. The words came steady, weighted by everything he had endured today: fear, anger, clarity, and conviction. Because justice isn't only about punishment, it's about preventing the next harm before it happens. Karen stepped into the logistics hangar just as the siren lights pulsed red against the steel walls. The echo of his shoes clashed with the mechanical hum of conveyor belts and crate lifts, every step heavier than the last. Ahead, Brennick, Rowell, and two officers had Varric Solon cornered beside a cargo lift marked Restricted Access, Level 3. The tall stack of crates next to Solon looked untouched, their metallic seals glinting under the overhead lights. Solon stood still, palms visible, his breathing steady but eyes darting. He looked like a man caught too soon, just one move shy of disappearing. "Why use my son?" Karen asked, his voice slicing the air cleanly. No need for preamble. Solon glanced at him, the calm in his face cracking for a moment. He swallowed, shifting his weight like a man trying to delay the inevitable. "Because you were the one who couldn't be intimidated with money or delay," Solon said hoarsely. They needed leverage. The word they landed like an anchor. Brennick stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Who sent the message?" he demanded. Solon hesitated, then slowly turned to the control panel beside the cargo lift. He tapped a 6-digit override code. With a mechanical groan, the platform holding the sealed crates began to lower into view, each one marked with red access tabs and airport security insignia. "Everything's in there," Solon murmured, as if confessing to something too large for one voice. Karen moved toward the crates and snapped one of the latches. The interior revealed dozens of classified files, hard copy records, data chips, and physical briefings with embossed seals. The top file slid forward slightly, as if begging to be read. Karen pulled it out and froze. On the cover, Counselor Rendick Hailvar, Phase 2 Optimization Initiative. The name hit him like a cold wind to the spine. Hailvar, one of the highest-ranking infrastructure counselors overseeing regional funding and airport oversight committees. The scope of the scheme had just exploded far beyond a rogue staffer. Karen turned to Brennick, whose brows furrowed in recognition. Solon, now deflated, leaned back against the cargo lift. He controlled the funding channels. Hailvar had been pushing for exclusive rights to your next-gen medtech line for months. You said no. He wanted to send a message. Karen's eyes didn't leave him. "So you weaponized a child." "I didn't plan for your boy to be hurt," Solon said quickly, shaking his head. "I only meant to delay you, create a procedural trigger." Orvin overreacted. "I didn't expect him to flip the child. That was never part of the plan." His voice cracked then, guilt finally surfacing. His shoulders sagged as if the full weight of his choices had just landed. Brennick signaled his team. "He's done here. Get him out." The officers moved in, taking Solon by the arms. But as they began to escort him toward the exit, he looked back over his shoulder at Karen. There was no longer arrogance in his eyes, only a hollow warning. "They'll come for the story. Not for you. For what you uncovered." Karen stood there, the words hanging in the air like frost, already crystallizing into something larger. This wasn't about retribution anymore. This was about exposure. And the truth was no longer a private reckoning. It had become a public threat. As the security team sealed the crates and cataloged the evidence, Karen took a slow breath, the sharp scent of metal and paper mixing in his lungs. The names, the files, the whispered schemes, it had all been waiting beneath the surface. Now it was open, vulnerable, and dangerous. Because pulling one thread doesn't end a web. It exposes how wide it truly is. The tribunal reconvened later that evening with urgency carved into every movement, every expression. The lights inside the administrative chamber dimmed to a cold white, casting long shadows against the polished floors. Saren Vale, Dallin Maris, and Jorn Havek sat already in position, their faces grim, back straight, files spread before them. The weight of what had been uncovered earlier now filled the room like thick smoke. Karen Vance stepped in, his son Dara seated in a medical wheelchair beside him. A soft gray blanket lay across the boy's lap, masking the surgical brace beneath. Karen's jaw was tight, his movements precise, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if every step marked the distance between injustice and truth. He refused to leave Darius behind, even for this. Especially for this. Saren Vale stood first. "Dr. Vance," he said, nodding respectfully, "we've reviewed the contents of the recovered files and have correlated them against multiple vendor incident reports from the past fiscal year." His voice was firm but not unkind, the cadence of a man who understood that every word now had consequences. Dallin Maris followed, sliding a document across the table with practiced care. "This," he said, "is the core contract between the airport's Oversight Division and the Halevar Administrative Syndicate. We believe this is the keystone in what Varric Solon referred to as pressure optimization." Karen's gaze narrowed. The term sounded sterile, calculated, dangerous. Jorn Havek, the behavioral compliance chief, tapped his monitor and projected a timeline onto the wall. Multiple incidents have been staged at terminals linked to Counselor Rendick Halavar's contract zones. The goal? To create leverage, influence contract renegotiations, manipulate compliance outcomes by engineering passenger confrontations. The room held its breath. Karen didn't. "My son's fall wasn't an accident. It was part of a pressure model." "Yes," Saren replied, his expression tight. "Your company, VanceGen Systems, was flagged as a high-resistance entity. You'd previously refused Halavar's attempt at exclusive rights during last quarter's bid cycle. That refusal triggered targeting. The dramatic irony settled in. The moments Karen had believed were isolated acts of provocation had been the latest in a long arc of calculated sabotage. He sat straighter, not just for himself, but for every passenger who had been turned into a pawn without knowing. Havek raised a second file, this one thinner, more clinical. "We've also discovered that Orvin Lusk, the flight attendant in question, had been unknowingly signed up for a performance incentive tied to Halavar's initiative." Karen's head tilted slightly. "Unknowingly, he believed he was part of a pilot safety evaluation program," Havek explained. "He was given indirect prompts, coded language that encouraged strict interpretation of safety guidelines. His bonus was tied to incident clarity and enforcement compliance, which is essentially a euphemism for escalation. So he thought he was doing his job," Karen said slowly, anger cooling into something sharper. Halden Rurik, who had been silent until now, finally stepped forward. "We've detained Halevar in his administrative suite. No resistance. He's in holding now, awaiting formal charges." He placed a thin sheet of printed notes before the tribunal. "Coercive contract manipulation, endangerment of passengers, falsification of operational data." Darius shifted in his wheelchair, the movement soft but noticeable. Karen placed a hand on his son's shoulder. The boy looked up, eyes tired but brave. "Are we safe now?" he asked in a whisper. Karen nodded once, then faced the tribunal. "You asked for a statement. Here it is." He rose to his full height, voice calm, controlled, but every word laced with steel. "My son's pain became their tool, but now it becomes the reason this system changes." Dallin lowered his pen. Saren pressed his fingertips together. Jorn stared at the wall a long moment before speaking. "Then let the record show. This tribunal declares the incident aboard flight Virion 813 a deliberate manipulation resulting in harm." The gavel fell, not loudly, but with certainty. Karen's grip tightened gently on Darius's shoulder. The fight wasn't over. But this moment, this verdict was a break in the chain. and somewhere beyond the sterile room, others like them would soon realize that silence, when broken with truth, becomes a force too loud to suppress. For when justice rises from injury, it reshapes the systems that allowed the injury to occur. Weeks passed, and the airport underwent sweeping reform. It began with a quiet ceremony no one was invited to, just 3 maintenance workers silently replacing the old policy placards outside Gate 27A. New ones gleamed with a subtle gold trim, laser-etched with protocols about safety ethics, medical exemptions, and accountability during boarding. Few noticed it that day, but one man had been waiting to see it go up. Karen Vance stood in the distance with Darius, now walking slowly beside him with the help of a medical brace. The boy's steps were careful, but his balance had returned. What hadn't returned, however, was the ease in his eyes. Every time they passed an airport crew member, Darius's gaze dipped cautiously before flicking back up, reading expressions, as if testing the air for danger. Karen saw it. He felt it too, but he never said a word. Instead, he placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder as they continued toward the hearing room that would mark the end of their battle, and the beginning of something larger. Inside the tribunal suite, Karen now sat as a permanent member of the newly formed Passenger Integrity Committee, a civilian-led oversight body designed to prevent targeted harassment disguised as protocol enforcement. The room was familiar now, its thick walls, soundproof corners, and broad oval table. But today, the silence held a different weight. Not tension, reflection. Across from him sat former Attendant Arvin Kell, who'd once hesitated to speak and now served as one of the committee's key witnesses. He looked different, straighter posture, firmer voice, a young man who had come to understand the value of truth when spoken at the right time. He gave his final testimony that day, presenting logs he had saved privately, communications between staff, unspoken codes, silent nods. They corroborated everything Karen had suspected. Then came Orvin Lusk's request. He had been held pending trial, his charges now formalized, endangerment of a minor, falsification of safety narratives, and abuse of authority. But he'd sent a message, not to the board, to Karen. "I need to speak with him," it said, handwritten. They met in a secured, observation-monitored room. Karen entered first, dressed in a dark gray coat, face unreadable. Orvin was brought in, wrists uncuffed, but his presence guarded by 2 silent officers at the door. The former attendant looked thinner, tired, less sure of the lines he used to hide behind. "I didn't know how far they had planned," Orvin said as soon as the door closed. His voice cracked, earnest but slow. "I thought I was just doing my job." Karen didn't blink. He didn't lean forward or pull back. He simply answered, "Doing your job never requires harming a child." The silence afterward was like cold stone dropped into a still pond. Orvin lowered his gaze, the weight of his decisions now fully visible on his shoulders. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Karen didn't offer any. That, perhaps, was the final justice. Not rage, not revenge, just clarity. Outside that room, the world was changing. Counselor Rendick Halavar's hidden network of coercive contracts had crumbled under the weight of public and corporate pressure. Over a dozen companies came forward, each submitting documentation of manipulated negotiations, orchestrated compliance incidents, and behavioral targeting. One by one, the contracts were voided. Investigations mounted. Funding pipelines froze. Halavar's influence collapsed like a house of cards built on silence. The airport board, eager to distance itself from the scandal, reversed every contract influenced under Halavar's directives, including the one tied to Karen's company. In an act of unexpected humility, they extended an offer, a consultative role in rewriting the airport's operational ethics framework. Karen didn't respond immediately. He walked with Darius instead, circling the terminal's edge until the boy's leg began to ache again. Only then did Karen say yes, but with a single condition written plainly across the agreement. No staff member will ever be pressured to provoke harm again. Months later, the final plaque was installed. It stood near Gate 27A, polished and centered between 2 benches. Families sat nearby. Crews walked past it. Most didn't read it. But one day, Karen lifted Darius gently in his arms and pointed to the plaque so he could see every word. The boy looked at it, lips moving as he read aloud. Integrity is not a rule. It is a responsibility. Karen studied his son's face, watching the slow smile break through the shadowed memory. Darius turned to him, voice soft. This happened because of us, right? Karen nodded gently, emotion flickering behind his calm eyes. Because sometimes a single moment of truth can change an entire system for those who come after. And so the hurt of one became the shield of many. In moments, the airport's contract was revoked, leaving the executives stunned and the cabin silent. If you believe real authority combines preparation, precision, and decisive action, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.